It's 6:01 and we're gonna get on. So here's Stu Donlin.
How's everyone doing? As Dwayne said, my name is Stu Donlin. I'm the curator at the Crescent Beat Museum. We really appreciate everybody that is here tonight. We want to welcome you to yet another web series. This one's titled Gunnison Country, Mountain Wonderland. This is episode 4. All of our episodes and other content are available on our YouTube page, and this will be up there by the end of the week. So if you want to show it to a friend or you just want to rewatch it, please check it out. Quick thank you to our sponsors. We have Gunnison Trail and Hartman Castle Preservation Fund, and also our members and supporters. Both of you, thank you very much. And as a nonprofit, all support is greatly appreciated. A couple upcoming events that we just like to mention. There will be Mount CB historical talk, and we will be putting a pop-up museum up there. That's February 12th. This is going to be the last of a series of talks that have been going on. So if you haven't checked them out, they are a lot of fun and highly attended, honestly. So come and check it out if you have the time. Again, that's February 12th. And then we also are doing a historic pub crawl February 26th. It's going to feature authors of the Gunnison Valley. Dwayne will be one of our speakers there as well. So yeah, if you are looking for something to do or have a friend that's visiting that is looking for something to do, please come on by and we will see you there. So without further ado, we have Dwayne Vandenbush, and he will be talking about some of the railroads. So
Yeah, thanks a lot, Stu. A couple of quick things before we get on. Number one, we will have a trivia question again. In fact, I've got 2 trivia questions at the end of the presentation. First come, first serve. So Stu will tell you how to get on that when we're done. And it's first come, first serve on the chat box. Next week's presentation is going to be on the most significant thing in the history of the Gunnison country, and that's water. And it's pretty exciting. Doesn't sound exciting, but it is. And it's really the most important thing that we have in the West. So without further ado, tonight we're going to talk about railroads of the Gunnison country. And before we get into the Gunnison country, I got to give you a little background. So here we go. Before the coming of railroads in the American West, there were only overland trails from the Mississippi River out to the West Coast. And there you get a good idea of what they're doing. That's an oxen that are go back to that one. So there are oxen pulling a covered wagon, and they're going on the Oregon Trail, which ran from St. Joe, Missouri, all the way to the Willamette Valley in the Oregon country, 2,000 miles. That route was fraught with danger. Indians, lack of water, malaria, exhaustion killed many. And yet, the West was the place to be. California gold rush was going on. The rich valley of the Willamette in Oregon was opening up, and rich mines in Colorado, Nevada, Montana, and Idaho were bringing people in. With thousands of people streaming west, the U.S. government appropriated $150,000 for 4 railroad surveys in 1853. When finished, the government would choose the best route for a transcontinental line. The Southern Survey was led by Billy Park, New Orleans to Louisiana, the Gulf over to the West Coast. The Northern Survey was led by Isaac Stevens, Duluth to Seattle, Great Lakes out to the Pacific Ocean. The 35th Parallel Survey was led by Emil Whipple, Memphis on the Mississippi River to LA. And the final survey, the 39th Parallel, would be led by John Gunnison, St. Louis to San Francisco. Beginning in the 1850s, stage lines began to carry people and freight in the West, the most famous being Ben Holliday's Overland Mail and Express. Holliday had the best horses and men. His line ran on time. He was honest, and he was regarded with awe. And that awe was best explained by Mark Twain, who immortalized Holliday in his great book about the West, Roughing It. And there's a good picture of Holliday's overland stage line with some information and some of the people who helped him out. In that book, Roughing It, Mark Twain talked about an old man visiting the Holy Land in the Middle East who runs into a young man who was there for the first time also visiting the Middle East. And the old man says to the young fella, Jack, do you see that range of mountains over yonder that bounds the Jordan Valley? The mountains of Moab, Jack. Think of it, my boy. Those mountains are renowned in scripture history. We are standing face to face with those mountains, and for all we know, dropping his voice impressively, our eye may be resting at this very moment upon the spot where lies the mysterious grave of Moses. Think of it, Jack. Jack says, Moses who? The old man is horrified. Moses who? Jack, you ought to be ashamed of yourself, of your ignorance. Why, Moses, the great guide, soldier, poet, lawgiver of ancient Israel. Jack, from this spot to Egypt stretches a fearful desert, 300 miles across. And across that desert, that wonderful man brought the children of Israel. He guided them safely over 40 years, over the sandy desert, among the rocks and hills, and landed them at last, safe and sound, within sight of this very spot. And where we now stand, they entered the promised land with anthems of rejoicing. It was a wonderful, wonderful thing to do, Jack. Think of it. Jack says, 40 years, only 300 miles. Hell, Ben Holiday would have had to fetch them through there in 36 hours. That was the awe that Ben Holiday was held in. The Civil War began in the year 1861. And the following year, the Northern Congress agreed to finance the first transcontinental railroad. You're getting a good look at a six-horse stage team in Deadwood, South Dakota. And that's again how people had to travel before the coming of the railroads. The Congress, when they financed the Transcontinental Railroad in 1862 with the Pacific Railway Act, financed it by paying $8,000, $16,000, $32,000, or $64,000 a mile, depending on the terrain. So if you're in the easy territory, like the Great Plains, you got $8,000 a mile. In the Rockies and the Sierras, it was $64,000 a mile. In addition, the Congress voted for the checkerboard system along the line. The railroads would get 1 square mile on either side of the track. 1 mile on the south side of the line, and then 1 mile further up, you'd get a mile on the north side of the line. And they made a lot of money off of this because they had the land rights, and they had the water rights, and they had the mineral rights. The Pacific Railway Act of 1862 sanctioned that building of the transcontinental line, but then the Civil War interceded, and most of the building didn't take place until after the war ended in 1865. Then, 2 railroad companies, the Central Pacific out of California and the Union Pacific from the Midwest, began building in 1866. The western terminus of the transcontinental line was Omaha, Nebraska, where the Platte River ran into the Missouri. There, the Union Pacific would begin building west under the direction of Thomas Durant and Granville Dodge. The workforce for the Union Pacific would be made up of Irish laborers. The Central Pacific would begin building the line east out of Sacramento, California, and the Big Four were in charge of the Central Pacific. And there you're going to get a good look coming up of the Big Four. Now, there's a total of 8 guys there, but the Big Four, are part of those, included Leland Stanford, who later on started a great university at Palo Alto, California. Collis Huntington, who's got a great library named for him in Berkeley, California. Mark Hopkins, the accountant. And finally, Charlie Crocker, the construction boss. Crocker reluctantly hired Chinese workers, even though they were small of stature. He had had good reports about their work ethic from California friends. The Chinese proved to be magnificent. They worked hard, did not drink like the Irish of the Union Pacific, and never got sick from bad water because they drank their favorite drink, boiled tea, which killed the bacteria. They were also small enough to be lowered in wicker baskets in the American River Canyon of the Sierras to drill dynamite holes, light fuses, and then quickly be hauled up out of the canyon before the blasts. Work went on from 1866 to 1869, laying rails through the Sierras. And there you get a good idea of what they had to do in the Sierras. Those are snow sheds, 37 miles of snow sheds in the Sierras, because avalanches came down over the tracks. Now they just come down over the snow sheds and no problem. So work went on through the Sierras, the desert that was the Great Basin, the Rockies, crossing the divide at South Pass, Wyoming, and then through the Indian-infested Great Plains. As the two crews approached each other in Utah, a bet was made between the owners of the two lines over which could lay the most rails in one day. A lot of money was bet, and neither the Irish of the Union Pacific or the Chinese of the Central Pacific wanted to lose. Pride was on the line. And there you see the two crews fighting against each other, laying tracks, trying to beat the others to win the bet. Both crews laid 8 miles of rail that day until the bet was called a draw. Finally, on May the 10th, 1869, at Promontory Point, Utah, two engines met nose to nose, and the transcontinental line was finished, Omaha to Sacramento. And there you got a good idea of the one of the trains nose to nose, and all the dignitaries were out there, and a golden spike was driven in, and the Transcontinental Railroad was a reality. It would not be the only transcontinental line in the U.S. By the 1880s, the Southern Pacific, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, the Northern Pacific, and the Great Northern ran transcontinental lines across the West. The railroad lines opened the West to settlement. Now miners, lumbermen, ranchers, and others could get their goods to market and get supplies back in return. Colorado had been looked at as the most direct transcontinental route between St. Louis and San Francisco, but surveys by John Gunnison and John C. Fremont showed that deep canyons and no good low pass over the Continental Divide would never allow that. That story begins now, in Colorado, I should say, a territory from 1861 to 1876 needed a railroad. And it needed a railroad because the gold rush had started in 1859, and many great mining towns were springing up. And it needed a railroad that could cross the Continental Divide and get to the West Coast, and also into its emerging mining areas. That story begins with the two greatest Coloradoans of them all, William Jackson Palmer and John Evans. Palmer was born in Delaware in 1839, and there you see Palmer on the right side of your photograph, along with other big railroad magnates. Palmer, as I said, was born in Delaware in 1839. He grew up as a Quaker and eventually came west, was the director of the Kansas Pacific Railroad after serving in the Civil War. He married a woman by the name of Mary Queen Mellon of the wealthy Mellon Steel family of Pennsylvania, and the duo went to London on their honeymoon. While there, Palmer saw in the paper that a man named Robert Fairley was going to give a talk to the British Locomotive Association, and the talk was entitled Rails of the Future. Palmer gave his wife, Queen Mellon, $200 to go shopping, and he attended the talk. There he heard Fairley talk about narrow gauge railroads, almost unknown in the United States. The advantages of narrow gauges, said Fairley, were many. It could go around sharper curves in the mountains, up steeper grades, be built for less money, and could get into areas faster than broad gauge railroads. In short, it was perfect for mountainous terrain. Palmer was impressed, and when he returned to the U.S., he started a narrow gauge railroad called the Denver and Rio Grande. That railroad would be unique in the United States in two ways. Number one, it was narrow gauge, rails 3 feet apart, as opposed to broad gauge, 4 feet 8.5. And secondly, it would be a very rare north-south running railroad, going from Denver, hopefully, into Mexico City. The railroad would tap into mining areas to the west of it and farming areas to the east of it. In 1870, Palmer began to build south out of Denver to Colorado City. There, he was disturbed by the drinking, the gambling, and the prostitution going on. So he decided to start a new city, Colorado Springs. If you go to Colorado Springs today, in the main drag, you see William Palmer on horseback right in the middle of Nevada Avenue. Colorado Springs began to be a haven for the rich, the new part of the Rockies, they said, Little London. It eventually featured the Broadmoor, the Antlers Hotel, and Palmer's beautiful home called Glen Eyrie or Eagle's Nest. From Colorado Springs, he built south again to Pueblo, where a steel mill had been built by the Colorado Coal and Iron Company. A railroad needed steel. At Pueblo, Palmer stopped building north to south because of the great silver town of Leadville, which needed a railroad. He turned west along the Arkansas River Canyon, and when he got to Canyon City, he had to fight a 4-year Royal Gorge War with the Santa Fe Railroad. And there you see a photo of the war that went down deep in the Royal Gorge because there was only room for one track, and both the Rio Grande and the Santa Fe wanted that track. After 4 years of fighting, a Boston Agreement was signed in 1880, with the Rio Grande getting the right to build through the Royal Gorge, and the Santa Fe getting Raton Pass, which allowed it to get into Santa Fe, New Mexico. Palmer wasted no time. He built through the Royal Gorge into Salida, which means the exit, and then ran his track straight north into Leadville, arriving on July the 23rd, 1880, Leadville's first railroad. However, that 60-mile stretch to Leadville from Salida was not the main line. That line now ran from Salida to Poncha Springs and then headed west over 10,846-foot high Marshall Pass into the Gunnison country. And here's a good picture of the Denver and Rio Grande heading up on the east side of Marshall Pass. Before the Rio Grande entered the Gunnison country, the way to get in here was primarily by Barlow and Sanderson stage. The Barlow and Sanderson stage held 22 people and was pulled by 4 to 6 horses. It left Salida at 7 a.m. in the morning, went over Marshall Pass, into Sargent's, down to Meechee Creek, into Gunnison by 2 o'clock, and then Crested Butte before dark. Every 12 miles, there was a stage stand where fresh horses were kept. The little stops were at Sargent's, Crookston, Parlin, along the Tomeechee, and then Gunnison. And then heading north, there was one at Almont and another at Jack's Cabin before getting into Crested Butte. So without Barlow and Sanderson and other stage lines before the railroad, there's no way you're getting anywhere. By July, the Rio Grande had come into Sargent's on the west side of Marshall Pass, and then continued 32 miles along to Meechee Creek into Gunnison, arriving on August the 6th, 1881. And there is a picture of the Gunnison Depot. Still stands today, a little worse for wear, but hopefully can be preserved. From there, the Rio Grande headed 28 miles to the north to the booming coal mining town of Crested Butte. One needed coal to run a railroad. Now we're going to show you there a collage of pictures. There is the anthracite coal breaker 4 miles up the Slate River, and you can see the tramway coming down from the Smith Hill mine. That was the largest coal breaker west of Connellsville, Pennsylvania in 1883. Next collage. There is the Rio Grande at the depot. 268 sits outside of the Gunnison Museum today. Next. There is a big coal train going by the Crested Butte Depot, heading towards Gunnison, and then over Marshall Pass to the CF&I steel mills in Pueblo. Next. There is the engine going right by the water tank out of Crested Butte with Mount Emmons in the background, with the world's 4th largest and richest molybdenum deposit underneath. Next. There is a rotary blade blowing snow out of Crested Butte heading for Floresta, 11 miles, a great anthracite coal town. And next, and the last one, and there's the problem that you had going from Crested Butte to Floresta. And a lot of times you couldn't use a rotary because avalanches had brought down snow, rocks, and logs, wood. So you had to dig it out, and they're digging it out right there. So we'll go to the next slide right now. And now we get away from Crested Butte, and from there, the Rio Grande's main line now continued out of Gunnison and headed west along the Gunnison River through little camps with names like Kezar, Iola, Savoya, and Saponaro. From Saponaro, we'll keep that for a second, Stu. From Saponaro at the head of the Black Canyon, Palmer's line ran 15 miles through the canyon to Cimarron. And at that point, his route through the canyon ended. Now, there you get a great picture of the Rio Grande going over the bridge in the Black Canyon over Crystal Creek with the Gunnison River flowing. Go ahead and hit the next picture, Stu. And there is the Kirakanti Needle. And you see the Rio Grande line running along the Kirakanti Needle through the Black Canyon. And now, the Black Canyon, we're going to talk a little bit about the Black Canyon. A lot of folks are waiting. We had a little pause in here. We had to move car out of the way in Crested Butte South. So we've got the Rio Grande now in the Black Canyon. There's the Kirakanti Needle. And I'm going to say a few things about the railroad in the Black Canyon, which featured some of the most fantastic railroading in the nation. The 15 miles of track between Saponaro and Cimarron in the Black Canyon were a railroader's hell. During spring and winter, high water, ice, heavy snow, rock, mudslides, and avalanches continually threatened trains. Louis Lathrop wrote a book called Little Engines and Big Men, and he called runs through the Black Canyon suicide specials. In January of 1883, a stunned Lathrop recalled, "The Black Canyon became a railroader's hell." And I'm quoting him now, "The perpendicular walls, particularly the north, vomited great snowslides down over the track and into the river. Imagine these tiny narrow gauge trains, a smarting little 8-wheel locomotive on the head end, dragging 4 or 5 cracker box coaches through that 2,000-foot chasm, taking chances on being smashed into matchwood by a thundering snowslide." The people who worked on the railroad in the canyon included 400 Italian, Irish, and Austrian workers, and they labored to lay tracks in the Black Canyon during the summer of 1882. New York reporter Ripley Hitchcock recounted the scene, and I'm quoting, "All along the road bed, gangs of men were unloading and placing ties and rails and leveling the surface. Presently a whistle blew. 6 o'clock had come. The men left their tasks and scrambled aboard the flat cars, and the train rumbled back to the hotel on wheels. There were swarthy Italians, Irishmen with carroty locks, men of a score of nationalities, begrimed, battered, gnawed at by the appetite given by labor in the bracing Colorado air. They swarmed into the old freight cars, which had been fitted up with long planks for benches and tables, mounds of coarse bread, pans of some strange stew, and pots of rank black tea appeared and disappeared before the workers. One by one they rose from the table, and presently the social instinct reasserted itself. They lighted black pipes and drew together. Some mended their garments. Others produced dirty cards or gathered to talk. A few clambered into the narrow board bunks in the cars and drew their blankets up over aching limbs. It was a glimpse of a hard and cheerless life that I had seen. But as I turned to go back to the construction train, someone struck up a rollicking Irish song, and others joined in until the canyon walls gave back the chorus. Violence came to the Denver and Rio Grande in the Black Canyon in 1882, as work went on in October of that year. An Austrian worker, Pete Theophile, got into a dispute with his boss, a man named William Hoblitzel, over when he would be paid. Theophile shot the boss in the chest with a pistol, killing him, and then covering nearby workers with a shotgun, escaped. Sheriff George Ewell and deputies from Gunnison were called in, and the next morning, 7 miles down the canyon, they arrested the Austrian. In the canyon, Ewell barely got by angry workers who wanted to lynch Theophile. Ewell got to Gunnison at 4 p.m. and, avoiding the main streets, lodged his shackled prisoner in the courtroom for extra protection. However, at midnight, 20 armed men with masks on overpowered the deputy, dragged Theophile down a flight of stairs, and through the snow to a livery stable on East Tamichi, where he was hung from the livery sign. It was the first hanging in Gunnison, but it wouldn't be the last. And that is what was going on in the Black Canyon. After the Black Canyon, William Jackson Palmer sent his chief surveyor, Byron Bryant, into the Gunnison Gorge downriver out of Cimarron. And when he came out 68 days later, he told Palmer that the narrowness, the tremendous drop of the Gunnison River in the canyon, and rock walls that vomited avalanches prohibited the building of a line there. Palmer had to come out of the canyon at Cimarron, and he built over Cerro Summit to Montrose, and eventually to Grand Junction, where his dream of building to the West Coast ended because of financial problems and the uncertainty of mining. Later in 1889, the Rio Grande ran a 36-mile branch line to Lake City, once a promising and booming silver camp, and the line ran parallel to the Lake Fork of the Gunnison. And there you get a great shot of the 85-foot-high wooden bridge over Elk Creek. And I had a great friend named Betty Steele from Lake City, who at 9 years old was hired by the Rio Grande every time that railroad ran over the trestle to walk the trestle with sand and water to put down any embers that might burn the wood. Later on, Betty Steele married a guy named Frank Wallace and became Betty Wallace, who wrote the original Gunnison Country book and one of the great historians of this area. Palmer's rival, John Evans, had attempted to beat Palmer into the Gunnison Country. There's a good shot, incidentally, of Lake San Cristobal with the Golden Fleece mine right behind it. And that picture is in the 1930s when Lake City was still kind of a promising silver gold area. John Evans was from Chicago, where Evanston, Illinois had been named for his family. He was one of the top 10 Methodist bishops in the nation, was involved in the Sand Creek Massacre against the Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians in southeastern Colorado, had been territorial governor of Colorado from 1862 to 65, and now he started a narrow gauge railroad. That railroad was called the Denver, South Park, and Pacific, and rivaled the Rio Grande. Evans began building in the 1870s. Denver, Morrison, Turkey Creek Canyon, Kenosha Pass at 10,000 feet, and then through South Park and Jefferson, Como, and Fairplay. And there you get a good shot of the Jefferson Depot and the water tank in the 1930s. After crossing Trout Creek Pass, Evans came to Chalk Creek and now attempted to cross the Continental Divide, not over a pass, but rather by digging a tunnel. And that was the beginning of the historic and famous Alpine Tunnel. Up Chalk Creek he built, past mining camps with names like Romley, St. Elmo, Hancock, and Alpine, and finally to the east end of the tunnel. And there you get a good shot of a place called Alpine, which is on the east side of the tunnel. Work began on the tunnel in January of 1880. Ignorant of obstacles facing them, South Park officials started construction of the tunnel from both sides at 11,523 feet in elevation in the dead of winter. Results, disastrous. And there's a great shot of a Denver South Park engine coming out of the west portal of the Alpine Tunnel, and it's going to continue on down towards Pitkin. Instead of penetrating through expected self-supporting granite in the tunnel, South Park found instead decomposed granite, necessitating the enormous task of timbering the entire tunnel. 500 men worked day and night in the tunnel, with work camps at both tunnel portals called Atlantic and Pacific. Getting men, supplies, tools, and animals to the tunnel was almost impossible, especially in winter. Working at high elevation, the Alpine Tunnel would be the highest in the world when finished, buffeted by 40 to 50-mile-an-hour winds, temperatures falling to 40 below. Men walked off the job in droves. Nearly 10,000 men would work on the Alpine Tunnel, most only lasting a few days. The conditions at the tunnel were tougher than any other railroad working conditions in the history of the West. During some of the heavy storms, men had to go in gangs from work to their cabins so they would not be lost in the snow and blizzard. And when they reached shelter, the clothes they wore were frozen. On January the 26th, 1881, workers on the Alpine Tunnel broke through. They could see daylight for the first time. From the west end of the Alpine Tunnel, workers built the palisade, rock work, creating a rock wall 450 feet long and 50 feet high, carved out of the edge of a cliff so rails could be laid. Then it was around Sherrod Curve, past Woodstock, and there, ladies and gentlemen, is the Woodstock camp right along the Denver-South Park line, about 10 miles from Pitkin. Avalanche hit it March 1884, killed 13 people, wiped out the camp forever. And there they're digging out the avalanche. And now we'll go to the next photograph. On July the 26th, 1881, as I said, workers broke through. And now you can see a Denver-South Park Railroad going past Midway. You can see a bunch of cabins there, heading down the west side and heading down towards Pitkin. So eventually to Quartz, then to Pitkin, finally to Parlin, and then along the Tamichi and into Gunnison, September of 1882. It had lost the race to the Rio Grande into Gunnison by 1 year. The South Park then ran 15 miles up Ohio Creek, heading for the booming silver camp of Irwin. And there you got a great shot of a train, a Ford four-engine train, which is pulling some coal cars, some merchandise cars, and a mixed car, 12 cars, 4 engines heading up to the Alpine Tunnel. And that's what it needed to get up there because the grade was pretty steep. The grade to Irwin was laid almost to the camp, including a famous palisades, which still exists today. But the Irwin boom had busted, and the tracks dead-ended 15 miles from Gunnison at a town called Baldwin. South Park had lost the race to get to the booming Gunnison country by a year, but it went into the annals of railroad history as one of the most fantastic railroads ever. The Alpine Tunnel was built with a slight apex in the middle to allow drainage into East Portal. 500,000 feet of redwood timber was used in the tunnel at $80 to $100 per 1,000 board feet. In addition to the redwood timber, 1.5 million feet of false timbering was also required. The Alpine Tunnel was 1,771 feet long, and with approaches constructed of heavy timber, it measured 2,500 feet. The cost of building the tunnel was $300,000. That'd be millions of dollars by today's standards. Long snow sheds were built at East Portal to keep snow from drifting in. Mammoth swinging doors were at both ends, only opening on a signal from engineers of approaching trains. At the West Portal, there's a great shot, ladies and gentlemen, of the Palisades. 450 feet long and 50 feet up and down, no mortar, carved out of the edge of the mountain to allow trains to go through. Now, they had a slide over that 4 years ago, but they have now got the rocks back in place, and that road to the Alpine Tunnel will open up this year. At the West Portal, a little community where South Park men lived was called Alpine Station. The little camp included an engine house, 54 feet wide and 153 feet long. Inside was a large coal bin and a 9,500-gallon wooden water tank. A bunkhouse, storehouse, section house were also there. A telegraph office opened in 1883. South Park was indeed a railroad named Desire. In 1895, 4 men died of an accumulation of gas in the Alpine Tunnel while trying to clear a cave-in. The last train ran through the Alpine Tunnel in October of 1910. The failure of the Gunnison Country mining boom and the enormous expense in keeping the line and tunnel open marks its end. And a little personal statement. When I first came to the Gunnison Country in the early 1960s, you could still get into the tunnel on the west side by sliding down a small opening for about 20 feet, and that took you into the tunnel. You could then walk 2/3 of the way through. And there we are. That's myself on the right, and one of my graduate students named John Carnahan, 2/3 of the way through the Alpine Tunnel, where an avalanche had come in, a cave-in had come in about 1/3 from the east portal. Now, when you went in, you had to have a carbide lamp and hip boots. And, next picture, there we are in the canyon, your eyes popping out if you look directly at the canyon. And then the next photograph is going to show when I first got in there, I slid down that 20 feet, and the first thing I saw was this. It looked like a giant spider, which actually was white algae on the canyon walls, and I think I jumped about 5 feet when I saw that. The narrow gauge railroads of the Gunnison Country and the Colorado Rockies pioneered a new science in railroading. Now to those areas came 30-pound rails, snow sheds, narrow gauge engines, and rotary engines. Things would never be the same again in railroading. Operating in mountainous terrain, the railroads of the Gunnison Country were slow and deliberate, leading to the following comments. You didn't want the narrow gauge to run over you because it was on you for so long. On time, anytime. And a legendary story about a guy named Finnegan. He had to write up wrecks when they occurred. And he wrote up a wreck between Gunnison and Crested Butte, right outside of Crested Butte, one year in 1885, 2 pages long, and his boss said, too long, boil it down. Next wreck, again, about 3 months later, wrote it up in 1-page report. Boss said again, too long, boil the next one down. Finally, a following wreck about 3 months after, and Finnegan's report went off again, on again, gone again, Finnegan. The Denver and Rio Grande and the South Park narrow gauges were instrumental in opening the Gunnison Country. They hauled out ore, coal, cattle, and farm produce. They also brought in and sent out passengers. Up to the 1950s, the Denver and Rio Grande was the only way in and out of the Gunnison Country because Monarch Pass was closed for 6 months out of the year. And Cochito Pass was often also closed. They also pioneered new railroad science, and their charisma is still legendary today. Through the mists of time, we can still see them, clinging desperately to rock cliffs, braving the fear of Black Canyon, and rotary blades cutting through deep snow. Then, in 1952, the coal mines closed at Crested Butte, and 3 years later, the end was near, and the railroad tracks were pulled out. The Rio Grande tracks in the Gunnison Country removed in 1955 by Paul Brinkerhoff of Salida, using a crew of Western State College football players. And finally, E.J. Haley immortalized the South Park heading up to the Alpine Tunnel on Christmas Eve, 1887, in the great book written by Mac Poor called The Denver, South Park, and Pacific, and I quote, "A glance at our orders, we see that they say, we must stop at water at Quartz or Midway. The tank at Woodstock must be frozen up tight. I'll bet it's cold up on the pass tonight. The icy wailing winds that whisk away the steam, and swirling flakes that slant across the headlights' beam bring starkly to mind the miles of ice, snow, and stone that lie between me and a gay Christmas home. So we bid adieu to the great 2 narrow gauge railroads that meant so much to the Gunnison Country, the Denver Rio Grande and the Denver South Park and Pacific." And that'll conclude everything, folks. And now we are ready for the trivia question. First come, first serve. And Stu Donlin is going to tell everybody how to answer the trivia question.
All right, for trivia, you're gonna just go into the chat here, and the first person that has is it just one question?
2 questions.
2 questions. both correct answers first, they will win the prize.
They'll get a book called Lake City, which we talked about a little bit today. So if everybody's ready, and Stu is ready,
I'm ready.
here we go. Here are the two questions. Number one, how did the Denver and Rio Grande and Denver South Park and Pacific cross the Continental Divide? And number two, who were the founders of the Rio Grande and the South Park? And we'll await the answers to the questions in the chat box. First come, first serve. Marshall Pass and the Alpine Tunnel, Glow Cunningham, but we don't have the founders yet. That's question number two. Marshall Pass and Alpine Pass, Alpine Tunnel, I'll give you that, and Palmer and Evans. So Bill Grierson wins. Bill, we're going to ask you to, when we get finished here, to give me your address, and I'll send you the Lake City book out. Congratulations. Now, folks, are there any questions that anybody has or any comments that anybody has? Happy to answer any questions if I can. So feel free to ask any questions or, give me a chat. Yeah, thanks, Pete. There's Bill's address, which is great.
Got it. Thank you, Bill.
Yeah, thank you, Bill, for doing that. Any questions that anybody has on the railroads in the Gunnison country, folks? Remember, next week it's going to be water, and that is number one in priority, number one in importance in the Gunnison country. Any other comments or questions that anybody wants to make? Feel free to do so.
You can just throw it in the chat there.
Yeah, put it in the chat box. It's great to have everybody on board tonight. We had a good crew on board. Going once. There we go. Patrick, how much of the railroad bed can you still find in the Gunnison area? Not very much. Unfortunately, the right-of-way was sold by the Rio Grande and the South Park. But if you look carefully when you drive from Gunnison to Crested Butte, you can see it elevated alongside of the Slate River and the East River as you go in.
I'll ask a question here.
Can you speak about Floresta? Yeah, Floresta Glow was located about 14 miles west of Gunnison, right along Anthracite Creek, original name Ruby Anthracite. And that opened up as Ruby Anthracite in the early 1880s. And then the name changed in 1887 to Floresta because of the trees nearby. And that was a tremendous anthracite coal camp. 200 people lived there. And in 1898, they built a 5-story high coal breaker for $98,000, surpassing the one at Anthracite Smith Hill as the largest anthracite coal breaker west of Connellsville, Pennsylvania. The problem was that the track from Crested Butte to Floresta was only open 6 months out of the year because of snow. Now, a couple from Texas has bought it. There's 1,650 acres there, and they want to preserve it, which is fantastic. So it's still an area, you can still see a lot of stuff there today. How did they keep the water tanks from freezing? Well, they kept it inside, and that's an awful good question. And I don't know, except I know they kept the water moving. Now, I don't know what they had in there, if they had a pump or not, but I think that's what they had to keep it going. But that's a good question, Barb. What happened to the plans to extend the railroad over Ohio Pass? Well, as I said, that's a question from John. The answer is that the boom in Irwin had ended, and they graded almost all the way over Ohio Pass into Irwin and then stopped. And you can still see what locals call the Chinese Wall, but it wasn't built by Chinese. And it's a palisade just before you get to Ohio Pass. Pete Dunda, why wasn't there some commercial vision for the Gunnison to Crested Butte Railroad? Why did they pull up the rails so quickly? You know, Pete, the only answer to that question is that 68, 69 years ago, people did not think like they do today, and the environmental movement had not started. And the rails were just in the way. And the Rio Grande sold the ties, and they sold the rail. They sold the ties to the ranchers, and they sold the rails to other companies to be used. And you know, I agree with you. If the Alpine Tunnel was open, if the La Vita Hotel existed, and if the railroad ran to Crested Butte, we'd be worth millions. But it just wasn't the thing to think about at that time. Yeah, Bill Greer, you can still see the South Park on the hillside above the Rio Grande grade as it entered Floresta. Yeah, now, Bill, the South Park never entered Floresta, the Rio Grande did, but you're right. You can see the cut and you can see the grade as you go into Floresta. Absolutely right. Any other questions, anybody? Or comments? Yeah, thanks, Marianne. Great to have you on. Any other comments that anybody has? If not, thank you very much for being on, and I will see everybody next Tuesday when the topic is going to be water, and we will have two books to give out. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks again, everyone. See you next week.